Sometimes a hero wears a cape. Sometimes heroes do science. And sometimes heroes have to put highbrow officers in their place while learning how to be good commanders in the Napoleonic Wars and also having sex with a lot of women. We're talking about Sharpe. Richard Sharpe, the star of British novels and then British TV shows that I've said were BBC. They're actually ITV. And it's Sean Bean in a series of basically TV movies that have a lot of great questions to ask about the Napoleonic Wars, about warfare, about class, about gender. And we're going to talk about all of that with myself and Paul Hoppe right after this. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. I am joined as somewhat regularly, but still not an actual co-host by any stretch of the imagination, Paul Hoppe. Paul, how are we doing today?
We're doing good. I mentioned on our last podcast that we recorded very recently, like this morning, that I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. It's not because I stayed up watching more episodes of Sharpe. I stayed up because I couldn't fall asleep, and I realized I wasn't going to fall asleep, so I ended up watching another episode of Sharpe, which is really a series of films.
Yeah,
right.
It's funny because it's listed on the streaming service where it's listed as having seasons, and I said this to Paul, and Paul was like, "What do you mean seasons?"
Yeah,
because it was if you remember during PBS pledge drives, they would often show BBC stuff. That's where I watched like Claudius for the first time. That's where I watched Fawlty Towers and a lot of other stuff. This started airing a little bit later, and so I never caught it originally, but Paul had seen it. And it is, first of all, so there's a series of novels about this character named Richard Sharpe, who is based on a real character, by the way. I'll get into that in a little bit. And ITV, this British television station, basically made a series of movies, but they were released on television, and I guess they kind of have like things that hold them together, so they're grouped in seasons. I think maybe they were released all in the same year or something like that. But they're all about an hour 20 to an hour 40. They all have a fairly distinctive beginning, middle, and end. And then many of them continue characters or continue plot lines from the other, but they're basically a series of standalone movies. And in this, we're basically going to introduce you to the characters, the concepts, the ideas that are being discussed, reference some things from, I have seen the first 5 movies, what are listed online as season 1 and season 2. Paul has seen all of them most of them at various points, but some many, many years ago, and read a lot of the books. We're going to be talking about them in general. Some of these specific movies we may go into more detail about, but we'll give you just kind of a brief overview of what they're about and who the character is. But let me just start with Paul. What was it that drew you to these novels and books and were ones that you suggested to me as things we could talk about?
Yeah, so my mom goes through actor phases where basically she'll see something, think an actor's fantastic in it, be correct, of course, because her acting taste is impeccable, and then watch literally everything that person has ever been in. And so she watched an adaptation of Clarissa, the Samuel Richardson novel, and either the or one of the longest books or novels in the English language. It's like 1 million words, like 1,500 pages. Okay. It's ridiculous. So they made a series of that.
And yet, even with all that words, this Clarissa does not explain at all. It's a different movie, different character.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So Sean Bean played the, I guess, villain antagonist in that, Lovelace, right? And so then my mom started just watching everything he was in, which included this Sharpe series. And she had this real interest in the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon, I think more specifically, probably less about the wars and more about, the other stuff going on. But so she was watching these and she was just like, I think you might like this, and, we recorded them on VHS as one did at the time this was probably like 1997, because when I remember really watching these was, after I'd left college, which, I attended very briefly. I read more books in the next 6 months than I had read in the entirety of high school and college. And part of that was this, where I watched this series. I think it's a really good series. And it sparked an interest in like history generally, right? And specifically, I read all the novels that were available at the time, I believe. Then some more came out later that were about sort of backstory stuff. But I read all of the main, the core novels and watched the entirety of the series as had been produced by then. I think May of 97 is, spoilers. It's titled Sharpe's Waterloo, right? And, as one who's heard anything about the Napoleonic Wars, that probably rings a bell. Maybe you're thinking about ABBA, but generally it probably, gives you an indication what happens in the stories.
Well, and even the first line of the ABBA song says, "Aha, at Waterloo, Napoleon did surrender."
Right. So even if you're just an ABBA fan, you still know what we're talking about. Yeah. And then they went and made some in 2006, which I do not believe I've seen. And those are... There's like stuff that takes place in India, which I'm really curious to see how this character in the story plays in the British occupation of India, right? Yep. So I'm curious about that, but also kind of afraid. It's interesting because in this war, it's like, if you had to ask me which side I would be on, like, I'm not a proponent of Napoleon and the French Empire becoming an empire and going in and invading a bunch of countries. But at the same time, like, overthrowing the monarchy, overthrowing, theocratic rule. Yeah, let's do that, Yeah. So it's interesting. But, the series, I'd say it doesn't paint a picture of, rah, 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 merry old England. It's like, I think, very critical of a lot of things about the culture and about maybe not as much specifically the war itself, because I think, thinking about the series, I'm like, yeah, is this the last like war that, the British can be like, yeah, we won that one. Like we just won it,
there's a number of other colonial wars they get to say that about for the next century.
Well, one that you can maybe feel good about, the way like Saving Private Ryan, in the U.S., people made that and were like, this is a war that the U.S. was fighting against the Nazis, and so we can make a gung-ho kind of war movie about it, as opposed to Vietnam.
And if you want to listen to our thoughts on America being 100% the good guy in World War II, last week we put an episode out about Gojira, the Godzilla movies, and that I have some thoughts on that. But for this, let me give a quick kind of summary of what these movies are about. So, in the first one, and there will be some spoilers here, we're not going to spoil too much, but, I think it's going to be kind of trailer level of spoilers. We may go deeper.
I agree.
You can always stop and watch them and then come back. But basically, the movies start with Richard Sharpe as an enlisted man, not an officer.
Sergeant.
And it's a sergeant, a very specific distinction in England, as we're going to learn. And he happens to be on a battlefield at the same time as the person who will eventually become Wellington, the Duke of Wellington. I think his name is Wellesley at this point.
That's correct.
Is almost killed by the French, and Sharpe rescues them and kills the French snipers who are trying to kill Wellesley, or the people who are trying to attack him. Wellesley is deeply impressed by him and immediately promotes him to lieutenant, which kind of kickstarts the plot because it does two things. One, it puts him in command, and so a lot of the movies are then about him learning to be in command, and then also about him dealing with command and the people he's commander of. But also, and we learned this in the first movie, in England at the time, as in many societies, but especially in England, there's a very rigid class system in India. There's a very rigid class system in England that applies to the army as well. And part of that is that officers are all gentlemen. And by gentlemen, I don't just mean like the way we use that today. It specifically means noblemen, people from the upper classes in Britain. I think it specifically means part of the nobility in some ways, like landed people in some way, but it may also mean people who are in the kind of bought their way into the upper class. And certainly at this time, people could buy officerships with no actual military training. It did happen from time to time that a person would be enlisted from basically promoted from the enlisted men into being an officer, but it was often regarded as a bad idea. And so most of the officers are very reluctant to have Sharpe be an officer, and they're constantly talking about how he doesn't know the right manners. There's an idea of like, men are brutes, and so they must be led by a gentleman. And we're obviously frequently given the proof that that is not correct by any means. It's very much a like, man from the hard scrabble does good. But an interesting twist on this trope that I think actually really works and does feel believable, some of the people who most object to him being an officer are not just the other officers, but the other enlisted men. Because they're also used to, like, they've kind of bought into a lot of the system and have a real sense of like, no, it's got to be one of those officers who commands us. I'm not going to listen to one of us, just another, piece of scum like us. And part of that is part of that is, I think, a sense of like, we all have to stay on the bottom, or else, if anyone rises to the top, then we have to wonder why we aren't rising to the top, and the unfairness of that. And like, there's a lot of different reasons, but definitely they're very uncomfortable with him being an officer. And so with that kind of general tension set up, he then goes on a lot of adventures, and they're, the ones we've seen at least, they're set during what's called the Peninsula Campaign of the Napoleonic Wars, which is starting in around like 1807 and going all the way into 1815 eventually. This is the fight where Napoleon had invaded Spain, put his brother onto the throne of Spain, and basically been kind of ruling Spain as a client state. A lot of the Spanish were fighting back, and the English joined the Spanish in that fight. And so it's the fight, theoretically, of the French against the English and Spanish, but there's a lot of times where the Spanish are not really quite sure where they fit, or different sides of the Spanish are fighting against each other. And then Sharpe just gets to have a lot of fun adventures in the midst of all of that. I made a reference to his love life. I have often wondered why Sean Bean, who I think is a very attractive person in a very particular kind of a way, isn't often presented as a love interest in the things he's in. Apparently it's because he did all of that in this show. The only women who he's not paired with romantically, it's because they've already been established, are paired with one of his men or someone else. I read a description of the novels. The novels say that they are times where he, I'm trying, the exact quote was, he soldiered, fought, and shagged his way through Napoleonic Wars. So apparently that's common. I think there's they definitely feel like kind of like a play on the James Bond trope in British literature in these books. But yeah, I think so. They're a lot of fun. There's sometimes some very powerful emotional stuff. The fight scenes are for television in the 90s in Britain. I think, it's not the most realistic looking stuff sometimes, but I think it gives you a pretty accurate picture of what warfare at the time would have been like. And they're pretty fun scenes. And yeah, I think they just raise a lot of fun questions. Did I give kind of a good summary of the main report? What did I miss?
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it. I think I would just highlight a couple of secondary characters that I wouldn't, without getting too deeply into them. But yeah, well, first you mentioned James Bond, and it's funny because I think the first thing I actually literally saw him in was GoldenEye.
Oh, I didn't even know he's in that.
He plays funny. 006. He's the, spoilers for GoldenEye, the main antagonist.
Oh, interesting.
He plays
okay.
Alec. And he probably got that role because he did the Sharpe series. So, I saw him in the one thing, but I didn't even, I didn't even realize it. I went back and saw it. And, the nice thing about the Sharpe series is like, if you feel like watching something where Sean Bean survives 2 hours of story.
He gets lots of love and he doesn't get killed.
Exactly. It's like, then everything I saw him in since then, I was like, what the heck? Where's the guy I saw in Sharpe? The acting is similar, but, I'd say just two kind of critical characters. One is Sergeant Harper, who is not a sergeant at first, right? Sharpe is put in control of this little squad called the Chosen Men, where they're like supposed to be crack shots. They're supposed to be like particularly good soldiers. So they've all been recognized for their excellence, right? And given like one stripe, which I think is like kind of like corporal, although maybe it's not actually corporal.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about Chosen Man being this sort of like official, unofficial position in the British military.
Right.
But in this, I think they're kind of like an early proto version of what we think of today as a special forces unit.
Right.
Like they're not just, okay, you have 10 regiments on the line and this is the 5th regiment. they're often sent like behind enemy lines to do something or to go to a scouting mission or sometimes, much to Sharpe's objections, a spying mission.
Right, exactly. And they so Harper kind of becomes the elevated one within them, the way, you know, Sharpe's been risen out of the ranks to become an officer.
Right.
And their dynamic, I think, is really interesting. I think we can get into more later. And then Brian Cox also is in the series as a spy master, you know.
Yes.
Basically, I guess, playing the same role as in The Bourne Identity and The Long Kiss Goodnight.
And for anyone who wants a more recent that actor isn't playing, he's Logan Roy, the titular father character in Succession.
Oh. Okay.
And so it's kind of fun hearing his very distinct voice in a very different kind of a role.
Yeah, yeah. And he and Harper are both Irish, as is Wellesley. Or at least part Irish, right? And so there's this whole, you know, dynamic of what role do the Irish have in the British Army, you know, when you know, the British are going around liberating countries from, you know, Napoleon's conquest. But it's like, I feel like the series, the novels and the shows are like interested in that, but not too interested in it, you know, like.
Yeah. Like in the first movie, and we'll talk about some specific issues, but I think this may be a good way to get into this one. In the first movie, I remember saying at the end of it to Paul, I don't know if this was intentional, but I found myself rooting for the French. And the reason for it is one of the things that Napoleon is a figure who I think is often presented, particularly because our education is mostly like English-based, I think is more negatively perceived in at least the education I got than is fair. But I also think that therefore the response to it can be, oh no, he was great and wonderful, which is just as wrong, I think. I think
like,
he was.
Like Stalin, kind of, right? No? Or
I would think of Stalin as much, much, much worse.
Okay, okay, fair. I just meant in terms of, what I mean is that I feel like Stalin is like portrayed as this villain in the U.S. education system. And then a lot of people are like, oh, but maybe some of those aren't so bad. So like maybe he was the good guy. And it's like,
yeah, both extreme. Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think like to me, like Napoleon was one of a number of European rulers at various points in this time who tried to conquer large amounts of land.
Right.
And try to conquer large amounts of people. And like, that's not cool, as you said. And on the one hand, he was carrying out a lot of the French Revolution's ideas. Mm-hmm. And he brought, he pushed back on the papacy in a lot of places, and that's a big plot point in some of the Spanish episodes. He brought a much more specific rule of law as opposed to absolute monarchy, and the Napoleonic Code is still used as the basis of law in France and a couple of other countries. In many ways, he was a product of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought in terms of like more rational, you know, it's kind of like what we think of as like not liberal as the word is used today, but like the classical kind of idea of liberal as a like constitutionally based government as opposed to absolute rule. There was a lot of that, but he was also an absolute ruler.
Right.
And he certainly dialed back on some of that.
Yeah.
But in this particular episode, the first episode, we come to learn that they're working alongside among one of the Spanish loyalists who's loyalist to the original king, Ferdinand, fighting against the French chosen Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. But one of our main antagonists is this guy's brother. And the brother is saying, no. Napoleon didn't conquer Spain. He liberated Spain. Mm-hmm. And he liberated Spain, among other things, from the papacy, which it was, as you said, a very theological country, that he's bringing reason and like those ideas. And he at one point says, like, you know, he's talking to Sharpe and to his brother, and he says, your Spain is a Spain of soldiers and monks, of cold monasteries. Mine is a Spain of science and diplomacy, of, you know, court of education and enlightenment and things like that. And that's where I was like, I like your Spain a lot better.
Yeah.
And the truth is, I mean, I think like, and that's, you know, the majority of the Spanish people were against that vision of Spain. So it was like a liberation war. That was also in part because they were very, very, you know, immersed in Catholic ideology. And like, that's a problem in a lot of ways. I don't mean that as an attack on Catholicism. I mean that any kind of theocracy. And I think, like I said, I think the movie uses that as a plot point to give you some pathos between this fight between the brothers. but it's pretty clear that the English supporting one is going to win and that we're supposed to feel happy about that. And I think that the way you put it is very accurate, that like it's using the Napoleonic Wars as a backdrop, but there are specific issues it wants to comment on, such as class, but the Napoleonic Wars itself are not really one of them.
Yeah, exactly. And one character that I left out is the like leader of the, I guess, guerrillas, basically, right? Or the Teresa.
Partisans.
Yeah, partisans. Yeah, exactly. And she, I think, is a really like, I think she's probably the best female character in the series.
Teresa?
Yeah. And
she's a spy. She works for kind of like the Spanish underground. Yeah. And she eventually falls in love with Sharpe and they get married and have a daughter.
Yeah. And you know, the series isn't the best in terms of, you know, female characters and women. And I guess the daughter is the only other female character Sharpe doesn't, you know, boink. But like,
no, there are some characters who other officers or other people.
Oh, right. Exactly. Who's that? No, I mean, besides the ones who are attached to, you know, but it is, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I mean, how would you, I feel like even having like Teresa as a character is like certainly an effort to try to be like, okay, let's not just have this be all about men and like the women are only attached to men. And because like when you think about the era, it's like, geez, like if you're telling a story specifically about the war and the armies, it's like, yeah, most of your characters are going to be male and most of them are going to be very misogynistic, you know? Yeah. And yeah.
I think you're right. Like Teresa is a character who I think is in four of the episodes, and it's a long arc. Like with her and Sharpe, they slowly get to know each other, they slowly fall for each other, and their relationship and her character is really developed over a number of episodes. And then, not even when she dies, but before she dies, there's also just a series of women who get taken capture and Sharpe rescues, and then wind up sleeping with him,
or not.
One quite.
There's at least one where they... What? You mean before?
There's one he rescues before. You're right. He doesn't sleep with. Yeah. There's one he rescues in the same episode where Teresa dies.
Oh, yeah.
Very interesting. He never has to deal with a moment of, did he just cheat on her? Because she immediately gets killed. And then later, there's even a scene where he rescues someone from a nunnery and who clearly has already decided she's going to reward him. Because as she's running out with him, she says, "Goodbye, I'm about to commit a whole bunch of adultery." But yeah, I think Teresa, it's always hard when you're talking about the way a show talks about an issue that we think of very differently today from the time it was told. And these, I think, have like with a lot of comic books where they're written, I think, about 20 years earlier and then made, you know, but still also like more than 20 years ago. And I think overall the treatment of women is pretty bad. And some of that's historically accurate and some of it's also like, but still, the possible essay of a woman character is a plot point in every single episode that I've seen, which is definitely not the best. It's not to Game of Thrones level because most often it's a threat, but still it's like, come on. We know that's a part of the story, but you don't have to keep
right.
It
doesn't have to be every single time. I do feel like maybe they slow down with that a little bit as it goes on, but like, you know,
okay.
I can't guarantee it.
But I do really like Teresa as a character because I think in those early episodes, especially when Sharpe is really finding himself, all three of the characters you mentioned, Teresa, Hogan, and Brian Cox, who his actor is just so dominant. Like, Hogan.
Harper. Yeah, Hogan, Harper, and Teresa.
That's it. Thank you. They all, I think, are in different ways helping him to grow into the character he becomes. Yeah. And so let's start with sort of who he is. Let's talk about how his struggles with class and how that is presented in the military is shown, especially in that first episode.
Yeah, I mean, you know, his backstory is like he was born to, you know, his mom was a prostitute and she got murdered, I think, when he was like 3. And then he grew up in an orphanage and then he grew up on the streets and then he joined the army because it's like, what else are you going to do, kind of, if you're, you know, broke and, you know, don't have any family. And So yeah, he's just like, he's a soldier out of like, what else is he going to do? Sort of, right?
Yeah.
Like out of, he needs a job or to feel like he has a purpose, I guess, you know, and it doesn't feel like he like is super motivated by England and this and that and whatever. It's like for him, he's a career soldier, you know, and
he's not, there's never big patriotic moments. He never says, I think, let's do this for king and country. It's really about, he creates this camaraderie and brotherhood among his troops. And then really it's about like fighting for his troops. Right,
exactly. He's very much, you know, and so he becomes, you know, a soldier's officer, basically, right? Which makes a lot of sense and sort of does underscore like, yeah, you probably should learn to be a soldier before you learn to be an officer, you know? But in the first episode, there's a thing where the whole plot is like that the one brother who, you know, supports the monarchy and the papacy wants to like put this flag of Santiago and like wave it and he thinks there's going to like be an uprising, right? It's going to like ignite Spain, basically. And, you know, Sharpe's like you think men will fight and die for a rag on a pole, like, and
specifically, I just want to say the rag it's associated with a story from 1,000 years ago that apparently it's the blood of this like martyred saint who fought for Spain. And so it's very much a religious symbol. Yeah. And that's part of, I think, what Sharpe objects to. Right.
And then Hogan's like, you do, Sharpe, you do, you know? Yeah. And it's like, it's true, but it's also kind of not true, you know? There's one Hogan line that sorry, this is a complete tangent, but like this is Hogan kind of bending the truth a little bit. There's a spot where Wellesley is like, do you think such and such? And Hogan's like, no. And then Wellesley's like, you're a liar, Hogan. He's like, that's what you pay me for.
Yes. Very true. Very true.
But yeah, it's like, you know, the idea of like fighting for your country, fighting for your king, you know, like Sharpe's fighting for the army that he's in because that's what he does. You know, it's like, it's almost like it's a purpose that's its own purpose. And he always wants to try and keep his men alive. There's a lot of like training scenes, you know, where he's like, you know, if you do what you're doing now, you're going to get killed. So I'm going to teach you to do this other thing. And then you might still get killed, but you'll be less likely to get killed and you'll be more likely to achieve your objective, you know? And, I really enjoy it in the first episode, how like Teresa is like teaching him but she's a leader of a group, right? And he's just become a leader. He's been a sergeant, you know, like the first thing we see him say is give an order. The first thing he says is, you know, eyes down, lads, you know, when Wellesley comes by. Cause like, you're not even supposed to look at the officers or at the higher, you know, general or whatever. But like, you know, he's had this like hard life and he's a soldier, but now he's a soldier's officer. And like, you know, he gains the respect of Harper by beating the crap out of him. And they beat the crap out of each other, you know? And then like Hogan tries to kill him and he's like, okay, we're going to take you back to Portugal to get shot by a firing squad. And then like Harper does some heroic thing, even though he really doesn't have to. And then Sharpe's like, all right, fall in. And the other guy's like, you know, don't you want him to give you some, you know, big reward? And Harper's like, he did. He told me to fall in, you know? And like, he's just, I feel like he's a character who, he's learning how to be an officer, but like he can empathize with the people he's commanding in a way that really no other officer that we see can actually empathize with them. He understands their actual jobs as well.
And one thing I really liked about that first story is that, like, when I saw the setup, I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be about how he's a better officer than the other officers because he understands the soldiers, etc. But he's pretty terrible at first.
Oh, yeah.
And in part, I think trying to, because he's only seen bad examples of officers for the most part, he winds up doing some of the things that they do. Like, it's a clear part of his backstory is that he at one point was whipped, flogged, as they call it, for a crime that he didn't commit. And early in the movie, Harper winds up getting into this really hard combat situation where instead of like properly loading his rifle all 3 times, he winds up at one point just like shoving the ramrod in and then firing that and using the ramrod itself as a weapon. Yeah. And that's part of why he not only stays alive, but saves the thing they're supposed to be saving.
Yeah. Which is the aforementioned banner.
yeah, Sharpe comes along, and all he sees is that like something went wrong with his rifle and the ramrod, and is like, oh, you did this wrong, I'm punishing you for it. And it was a really interesting moment of like, oh, like Sharpe screwed that up. And I think it's a very understated way, which is, you know, very common for English stuff especially, and I kind of like it. It's not, there's never a specific moment where Sharpe is like, I was wrong. But I think he starts asking Harper what happened instead of just assuming, and he starts listening to him and then taking him seriously. And I think that that's meant at like part of why Harper is okay with it is because Harper comes to recognize that Sharpe has grown past that and realized his mistake. And then for most of the later movies, at least that I've seen so far, including one where I really thought Harper was going to die, and I was very mad about it, but he didn't die. Harper becomes his second in command and really the person he talks to about a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just really like that we got to see his growth of him being like kind of a terrible officer and growing through it.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. I mean, it's always, you know, this is a series that to me shows a lot of the things that I want to see in things when I'm like, I feel like someone is already doing something that I'm like, I want to see them learn that, you know, and then I want to see them do it. I don't want to see them struggle with it every single time, you know, like, you know, I did, once you find your identity, like, be happy with it, be that, and, you know, be that person, right? But it's like the story of how someone gets there is also interesting. And it's worth noting that I believe was the 9th novel written.
Interesting.
But they made it's chronologically first of the, you know, the Napoleonic War novels. And they made it the first episode because it does show the backstory, you know, but the series originally, you know, he was already this guy. You know, and I mean, in the novels, when they started the novels, you know, Bernard Cornwell, like, was like, you know, this is the character I want, you know, and it would be like, you know, if you write your first James Bond and it's like, okay, this is Bond, but then you're like, okay, now I'm going to go and do kind of, so that episode was like, actually it's kind of like a prequel, you know, it's just they filmed it first. And yeah, the thing with the ramrod, he's like yelling at him about it, but then he listens to what he has to say. And I might have read the scene differently where I feel like he wasn't necessarily going to punish him for that. He kind of wanted to like get him to explain it in this sort of defensive way. And then he's like, all right, fall in. Cause that's when he says fall in. And the other guy's like, don't you want a reward? And he's like, he did give me one. I mean, also he decided not to have him killed. You know, that's kind of.
I thought the ramrod scene happened significantly earlier, but you may be right.
No, I'm definitely right about when it happened. There might have been another thing where he says, you know, you have powder burns on your cheek, Harper. That's a sign of going off half cocked, basically. And because he shot the ramrod through one of the French who there were like. The brother who wants to
I don't want to get too lost in the details. You may be right, but either way,
no, I am, but no, okay.
You have a time limit, so let's not.
No, I don't have a time limit. I have a time. Yeah, okay. Okay. Let's just move forward.
Okay. What was the point you were trying to make?
The point I'm trying to make. Well, I'll just say a thing.
Okay.
So what happens in the scene before that confrontation between Sharpe and Harper is the brother who wants to get rid of the papacy and the monarchy has two soldiers with him, right? And he says, you know, this bag of gold one of you will be rich and one will be dead because like he thinks he can only shoot one of them. And then one of them goes charging first, which seems like a really bad idea. He gets shot. Yeah. Harper reloads, but he's not really in time to reload. So he shoots and his ramrod, you know, hits the second one like through the throat or something. And then there's the whole thing with Sharpe that I'm not 100% certain exactly the sequence of their discussion.
What? I think it says something positive about the movie that you and I can read that scene in somewhat different ways. Because again, it's not hitting you over the head with it. There's a lot of subtlety to it. And as I think part of the point is that both Sharpe and Harper are both caught in this class system that is utterly ridiculous. And that now, because I remember being very surprised that Harper and all the others were so like, I get some level of resentment, but just like utterly refusing to accept his authority and do straight up mutiny.
Yeah.
That's why Hogan wants to send him home, because he attacks him and just was like, no, I'm not going to follow your orders. And he's trying to get all the others to be like, no, we're marching south. We're going back home.
Yeah. Yeah, and either you can come with us or we can kill you. Those are your options, basically. Yeah. And then they fight, and they fight really dirty. And there's this like, you know, oh, you fight dirty. And it's like, you fight dirty too. And it's like this admiration sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which I felt like their interaction there as like, having done Taekwondo for a long time and having some higher ranking black belts at some point, like people have these ideas about other people, right? And like we used to get together and just like beat the crap out of each other every Sunday. And like I remember distinct moments when somebody's sort of their perception or their like thought, they're like, oh, you know, that like, oh, they actually were able to, you know, fight in this way. And it just felt very real in terms of, I mean, I've never been in actual military, you know, but in terms of a group of people who spend a lot of time training and fighting, like there is this, like when somebody hits you in a certain way and it's like, there is this respect that can come from that. And then like friendship, you know, as long as no one actually causes permanent harm to the other one.
Yeah. or doesn't, I think you mean.
Right. Yeah. I don't even know.
I think that's really true. I think another part of it is, I think one of the things that the movies really play out, like we get a number of scenes where these military people, the officers who are gentlemen and often kind of foppish, and I think that word is used a couple times, they're not out there leading the charge. No. They're way behind.
Yeah.
And I think there's this, like, they really care about the nobility of warfare, you know, and like all these men marching in a clean, pure line and then lining up and firing and then getting fired at and just being noble and good in a really stupid way of fighting a war.
Yeah.
And that unfortunately continues in the British military all the way up until World War I. And that's a bit, there's tons of writing about that, about why World War I was so horrible in many militaries at the time. And I think part of the thing is that, like, because it's not the officers who are dying. Right. And they are so disconnected from the men who are dying like that. Like you said, these men don't even think they can look those officers in the eye, let alone complain to them. And I think that's part of what happens there is that Harper realizes, like, this guy gets that we're not, like, they're snipers. They're hiding behind rocks. They're shooting. Yeah. They very rarely just stand out in the open and fire like that. When they do, it's because of those dire circumstances. And I think that's another part of it is that, like, they Sharpe shares with that. And that a lot of their friendship in later episodes is born out of, like, the officers giving them some really stupid order. And Harper's like, you're not going to make us do that, are you? And Sharpe's like, no, we're going to figure something else out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the workaround. Yeah, in terms of the officers, too, I think I recall this didn't come up in the episodes that I rewatched just now, but I remember definitely from the books, like, there's this whole thing about, like, you don't shoot at the officers. Like, the officers aren't a part of the battle. They are there to oversee it. And then, you know, and then they wave a little white flag and they're like, oh, let's parlay. And then it's like, okay, we'll go back. 10 minutes? Yes. We'll send the men to fight each other again in 10 minutes, you know? And it's like, you know, and Sharpe's like, no, you shoot the officer, you shoot the horse, you know, which, like, I'm not in favor of that as an animal advocate. But, like, yeah, if you're in a war and there's someone on a horse, like, if you can, like, you probably do want to kill the horse and then it's going to fall over with the person on it. And, like, you know, again, not advocating it and, like, war bad, you know, and, like, using horses in war bad. But, like, you know, strategy, like, once you have an end, it's like strategy is, you know, a thing.
Yeah. No, and it's definitely true. And, like, The Patriot, which is an American movie with Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's terrible. The movie's terrible. It whitewashes slavery. It's horrible. But it does bring up that point that the British are very mad at him that he's targeting officers. Because, like, that's not how war should be fought. Right. It's supposed to be noble. And, like, there's one scene later with a truly ridiculous officer who gets mad that the men are cursing. You know, men should use, like, decorous language and stuff like that. And it's like, each individual movie plays it off in a different way, but in pretty much every movie, there's some sense of that, of the nobility being just so out of touch and so ridiculous. And a recurring theme is Sharpe in later episodes, is Sharpe seducing the wives of these noble men
Right.
who are clearly not satisfying their noble women.
Right.
And him being much more a earthy man of the people and is into that.
Yeah, and that, that feels like a 1980s, 1990s kind of like more, sort of I mean, not that that's not still a thing now, but I think it's more people are more critical of like having that be the role of women in something to be like a prize or like a way of like getting at some other man is, so.
And like, I think there's a lot of truth to the critique of the nobility of the time, but you can see kind of like something of a line from something like this to the today, like, no, you got to be a man's man. You got to know how to fix a truck, not be one of those foppish city boys.
Right.
So that's interesting to look at.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that a number of the characters were Irish, which is something I know a good deal about, and I'd actually, from the year living in Ireland and some of the studies I'd done, knew a lot about Irish in this point in time. I'm curious to start from you. So what struck you about those three characters all being Irish and how that played out?
I mean, not a lot. Like, it's interesting. Like, Harper, like, why does Harper join? Harper joins because he says, freedom to starve is no freedom at all. It's like, he wants a job. It's a way out,
Yeah.
And, a lot of you hear the backstories of the other chosen men and they're like, yeah, well, I could either stay in prison or they let me into the army. It's like, a magistrate. So, but like Wellesley and Hogan, I think are, their nobility, I guess, because they're officers, right? Or, the opposite of that. But, I do think it's interesting that like so many of the main characters are Irish and or main characters are, pivotal characters. And I think that it sort of makes it feel a little bit less like the war is on behalf of like, England. I mean, they talk about like King George and whatever a bunch, but like in this kind of vague referential way, not in a, we really care what he's doing kind of way. So yeah, I mean, I know you have more actual historical perspective on it, right? For me, it's just kind of interesting things about their characters.
Yeah, I think it definitely was. And I think it's an interesting part of the English Empire, especially because, and I think he will cause a full discussion of his own, but another character winds up being an American he was a loyalist. So he fled the colonies after the revolution because he thought the revolution was wrong.
Not an American, a Virginian, sir.
Yes.
Like he says that, so. Right?
And it certainly was true that like there were a lot of what they thought as colonials in the British military. I think though with those different characters, what we're seeing is that the word Irish can mean a number of different things in the English Empire, the British Empire at the time. And I think the characters are a couple of different levels. So for one, there were a lot of English settlers in Ireland. Yeah. That's obviously the source of a lot of the troubles and stuff. And a lot of them were English nobility. And my understanding is that Wellesley is one of those.
Yeah.
There's a famous quote by Daniel O'Connell, who's a very famous Irish patriot and freedom kind of early politician. And he said about Wellington, he is not an Irishman. He was born in Ireland, but being born in a stable does not make a man a horse. Which I thought was a very, clearly someone with a very specific political agenda. But
yeah. No, I mean, it's funny, but it's like there's. It feels different because we're talking about, the people descended from the occupying force compared to like, it's like, does being born in the United States not make you a United Statesian? Wait, the word's American.
Right. Well, yeah, because I think we don't often think about Ireland is European, but Ireland is the only country in Europe that was a colonizer rather than being part of like. There were others that I think there's some degree to it, but certainly Ireland was a colony.
A colony. In terms of like not a colonizer.
Yeah. Yeah, and that there was a distinct difference between the occupiers and the indigenous people, and then them intermixing and things like that. And I think that's kind of where some of this is coming from. And so you had people like that, and I'm guessing if Hogan was an officer, then he's either that or he might even be an Irish family that was like totally okay with the occupation and so became part of the nobility in Ireland or something like that. And then certainly you had a lot of people like Harper who were, as I said before, you know, when the colonies are getting starved of all the resources and jobs, often you go to the main place in order to find work. And certainly an awful lot of Irish lived in England. And this is all the way up to like Peaky Blinders days or even today, who would still think of themselves as Irish and be treated very much as second-class citizens because they were Catholic and hold on to their Irish identity, but still be English and thus drafted into an English regiment. As we later learn, he eventually gets control of the company from South Essex, which is a part of England where they're all from. Separate and opposed to that also, because Ireland was a part of the British Empire, you did have full regiments that would, from Ireland, go off to fight.
Right.
Many of whom were probably conscripted, many of whom were conscripted, many of whom probably were going because they just had hunger. But because this war was seen as, by many, an attack on the papacy by the French and things like that, when I was in Ireland, there's actually a lot of like, you know, statues to and reverence for the brave Irish volunteers who fought to protect the faith in Spain.
Right.
There's a great song called Fare Thee Well, Enniskillen, one of my favorite Irish folk songs, and it's about the Enniskillen Dragoons, a group of Irishmen who went to go fight for the English military. So yeah, so it's a very interesting thing, and I do really like the way that plays out, because I think Sharpe is definitely not that, but the Irishness is very subtly commented on, but I think you're right. It's very much there and a part of this whole, like, we are the people who are kicked around, not the people who get to do the kicking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting historical perspective. And that's sort of, that's one of the things that I like about this series, is that, like, overall it's a series of, like, fun adventure tales, basically, right? But like it wears like a coat of historical fiction, right? I mean, of like this historical context. And one of the things I think is powerful about historical fiction compared to like biopics, like I really just I don't like things that are like, I'll go away from like what I don't like, but like I enjoy how this is a series of stories that are like, here are stories that like I totally made up about, there's some historical figures and then there's some, made up characters. But like, the thing I like about it is I feel like it's more likely to kind of spark interest compared to something that feels like it's trying to tell you this is what happened. And then I'm like, there's a couple reasons I like the latter, the former better, is just like, I like having my interest sparked instead of like, being like, this is exactly the story. But also like, I think if something sparks your interest, then you can investigate and you can learn at kind of your own, like find different sources. Whereas I think a lot of historical stuff, and this might do some of them as well, but a lot of things that are like, here's the history of whatever, and it's like a film that's not a documentary, it like, I think can often give a false sense of like knowing like what really happened. Yeah. You know what I mean? And like, then not, and then if that leads to exploration, that's great too.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. And I hear why you label biopics as like the problem in that. I do think there's some biopics that do a better job of it and some that do worse, and some, as you say, like a retelling of actual events that are just as bad that aren't biopics. But I very much get the point you're making there. And I think having it be based on real people, but like, basically it's one of those kind of like, he winds up therefore being a key part of every important thing the English did throughout the entire war. Right. Which makes no sense whatsoever.
Of course.
But it's a way to sort of give, like, it's hard to tell a movie about an army.
Yes.
Like, because the whole point is it's not individual combat. It's not one sniper. It's hundreds of thousands of men on each side shooting at each other and finding more and more scientifically ways to blow each other up.
Yeah.
Go back and listen to our episode about Gojira, aka Godzilla, if you want to hear our thoughts on that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it's like, I agree with it. it's a fun piece of historical fiction that opens that door. And I'll certainly say I'd already learned a lot about this, but I definitely was going to websites and learning a lot more about Napoleon and Wellesley, Wellington, and these other figures because of these shows.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it inspired me to actually get a book about history, like the history of the world, and then read it, and then be just incredibly depressed that the history of the world is basically just people acquiring power and then abusing it to oppress people. And then there's sometimes there's a revolution, and then the people who led the revolution end up doing their own form of oppression, and then someone else conquers them, and it's oh my goodness. But then again, that's a way of telling history, right? That's not. Right. That's not all the history. There's a lot of stories that happened along the way that aren't in histories, as maybe a people's history, which I still want to read.
Yeah, because certainly it's generally about Napoleon did this and Wellington did this and maybe this other general did this, but it's never about the individual people on the ground.
Right, exactly.
So let's talk a bit about the specific person I mentioned, Colonel Thomas Leroy, who's the Virginian. It is very funny how, I think often we in the United States, Paul does not.
I am in the United States. That is factually accurate.
I think we're often taught that the American colonies breaking away from England and then fighting another war against them in 1812 were these seminal moments in English history.
Right.
My understanding is that from the English perspective, it's quite different. And it's probably maybe a little bit more significant than sometimes it's presented as, but certainly a lot less than we're presented as. And in these, the fact that they had lost the American colonies fairly recently is almost never discussed. In some of the later episodes that I'm watching now that take place in 1813, 1814, England is now at war with the United States again, the War of 1812, and that's nowhere on the... I mean, because from our perspective, it was a major war. From the English perspective, it was this, little sideline of a war that was being fought in all these different places in the world.
Yeah, spoilers, that does come up more specifically later, but I won't.
Okay, cool. Well, and so we're introduced to this character in, I believe it's the second episode, Colonel Thomas Leroy, who is...
I think he's a captain, Captain Leroy, but yeah.
Okay, I Wikipedia is telling me Lieutenant Colonel, but he might...
Oh, maybe he gets promoted in the series.
I found him very interesting because we are told that he was a slave owner. As he said, he has all this gold because of slavery, molasses, and rum.
Yeah.
And he clearly has no shame about it. And for the most part, no one else is judging him for it. England did, I think even by then, had outlawed the slave trade and, had offered to free slaves as part of the fight against the American colonies in the Revolutionary War. But clearly the military, no one is being oh my God, you were a slave owner, you're terrible. Sharpe at the very end of the episode has a comment about well, your gold came from slavery and that's not really great. But in a lot of the episode, I think there's an episode, well, I was going to say I think it's an episode where Sharpe gets into trouble. That always
which one?
But Leroy is kind of defending him a lot and is presented as he is not an antagonist by any means. Yeah. And he's presented as more sympathetic than a lot of the other officers, which I just thought was a very interesting way to portray a slave owner.
Right.
And again, I think that for a British perspective, not American, 40 years ago written and then 20 years ago, whereas today I think we're much, all the stuff about wanting to accurately teach slavery in schools. Slaves.
The history of...
benefit. Yeah, slaves did not benefit from being slaves, contrary to what certain states might want to teach. But yeah, I'm kind of curious how that struck you.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. I feel like they are trying... He's a likable character, in terms of what he does within the context of the episode. And, but he also is a party to despicable acts, right?
Right.
And involved in a despicable system of atrocities. And I think that's very real. I'm sure there, I think just hanging out, going to a baseball game with George W. Bush would probably be, as long as we didn't discuss politics, a pretty chill, relaxing, fun thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But the dude did some things that are unconscionable. you know? And like, that's true about, I think, many of the people who do unconscionable things, many of them with, you know, less power than, you know, the ostensible leader of the free world for 8 years, but like, are like on a personal level and also on a more specific level, like capable of doing good things too. Like, that's how people are, you know?
It is hard to be a successful leader without some degree of charisma.
Right.
It's possible,
for sure,
depending on what your power base is, but often some degree of charisma is a big part of what gets people to your side.
Yeah. And, you know, I think reading that book is where I learned the word laconic. Cause like every time they talk about an American character, they describe them as being laconic and
interesting.
But like it's, you know, I think he's meant to be like, to sort of show this other, you know, kind of perspective. Right. But then Sharpe does call him out on it, you know, at the end and but at the same time, like nobody else does. You know, and it's like, it's not super consequential that what, you know, I mean, what Sharpe says, what he says, but like, it's like, okay, yeah, you know, he's still going to be, but that's the thing, like probably most of the loyalists were slave owners, right? Like that was the main, or no, maybe it's not. I don't know. You know what? I rescind this, let that be stricken from the record. But like it, you know, being, I don't know. There's the whole can of whatever when it comes to like the American Revolution and, you know, how that maybe preserved the right, the system of slavery.
Like, I know a couple of years ago, I read this really great article. I wish I could find it again. This wasn't the title, but it was, I think in the subtitle or something like that. It was like, you know, basically it was Black Lives Matter through a British lens. And it was a black English person or a black British person talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's playing out in England and in Great Britain. And one of the things I remember that they talked about at length was how, you know, Britain has never really wanted to wrestle with its own racist problems. It's been starting to. But that one of the things that would often happen is like they were very quick to be like, America had, and another thing, like, slavery was American. And to kind of write it off as, and, you know, again, Paul's making a face right now because it was British ships that brought those slaves over for an awful long time.
I mean, it's the British colonies in America, like, right? I mean, it's like, you can't, you know, that wasn't us.
Exactly. Nor were the Africans who were brought into, you know, Caribbean islands and things like that, again, by the British to British colonies, treated well by any means whatsoever. They were also, for all intents and purposes, slave. I think that system of slavery was slightly or somewhat different than what happened in America, but still just as horrible and atrocities and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't know anywhere near about it. If people do know more, please write in low. But in that understanding of kind of an English writing off of slavery and racism as more of an American thing, I found this character very interesting in that lens. And so it's one thing I want to learn more about. Yeah,
for sure. There's one other actor in that episode that I'm wondering whether you spotted.
I saw all 5 of them in like 2 days. Like I spotted a number of actors and was like, oh, it's that person, and then immediately forgot.
So speaking of James Bond, Daniel Craig plays one of the officers who tries to off Sharpe at one point. I
totally missed it.
Yeah. I was like, that dude looks so familiar. But this is in like 1993 or something, you know? So he was like much younger. Anyway.
Even Sean Bean. Like, Sean Bean already looks like grizzled and war-weary, but he's so young in these.
Yeah. He's in his 30s, you know?
Yeah. So. All right. Well, I think this is going to be a shorter episode, and we will talk more about Sean Bean in our Patreon section. And I think, you know, if people are interested in these, let us know, because I think we could do some great analysis of like some of the individual movies. But Paul, is there anything else about the character in general you wanted to bring up?
I think we mostly covered the things I would have to say about the character. I mean, there's so many movies. I only rewatched the first 2, you know, and the rest of these, it's been 25-ish years since I saw and read them. So, one note that I would throw in is that they're largely filmed in Crimea, which
that's interesting.
Seems really interesting. Right? It's like there's a little bit of a parallel there.
The the English fought a war with Russia called the Crimean War in Crimea.
Yeah.
And then, like Russia has taken control of Crimea. And that's like if you think about the Odessa ports and the fight to reopen the Odessa ports and all that, that's right by Crimea.
Yeah.
It's that area. So.
And using the pretense that there are Russians there who want to be part of Russia as opposed to Ukraine, right? That was a big part of I mean, to what extent that's a pretense? I'm sure there's like some people, right? But like, was it enough people? You know, and I feel like that's a little bit of a parallel to the French in Spain, and not saying it's the same thing, right? But there's just a little, it's just kind of funny. I mean, you know, in the way that war is.
The very sad, dark, but at times funny, humorous irony. Yes.
Exactly.
I am a big believer in finding those moments, because or else it's all just so horribly depressing.
Exactly. Exactly.
I want to close just by saying a word or two about the inspiration for this character. There's probably a lot, you know. I haven't read much about what the author said, and I think James Bond was definitely a part of it. But there was a real life man named John Shipp. It was not completely unheard of to elevate an officer from the ranks, but it was rarely done. John Shipp, though, is particularly noteworthy because he did it twice. He was a sergeant. He fought in, notably, nowhere in his history do they talk about fighting in Spain. He did most of his fighting in India and then was now Nepal and some of that area up there, fighting almost entirely, wars of enforcing British colonialism. But he did something heroic. He volunteered for a heroic mission, was successful in it, was promoted to an officer. Apparently it kind of like went to his head. He went back to England and like gambled a lot and like could not afford to be an officer basically. And so kept all these different schemes and lost all of his money. And, I think went to jail at some point, was stripped of his rank. And then like 10 years later, he re-enlisted in the British Army, was again made his way up to sergeant, and then again did something heroic, and was again promoted to officer.
Hilarious.
So yeah, there's just a really crazy story about Mr. Shipp, and apparently he then like he wrote an autobiography, and like other people have written books about him. Like he's a pretty well-known character. Awesome in British military. So
yeah, that sounds like a worthy inspiration. I'm sure someone writing historical fiction is going to be like, oh, that seems like an idea for a story. There is one more thing on the character that occurred. Oh no, go ahead.
I just want to say
yes.
And so the last thing I'll say about the character, the real life person, Jim Shipp, and this is Paul, one that I started to read the sentence and had this paragraph and was very, very concerned, but it turned out actually pretty good because as it's described, his first actual military posting was in South Africa. And so his first major engagement was against baboons. And what wound up happening was they were in an area and the baboons were like circling around them and throwing excrement at them and otherwise sort of harassing them. And as he writes it, they, the baboons, observed my movement and immediately detached about 50 to guard the entrance, while the others kept their post, and we could distinctly see them collecting large stones and other missiles. One old gray-headed one, who we'd seen before, nicknamed Father Murphy, was seen distributing the orders and planning their attack. This is clearly rather fanciful, but, not entirely unknown. A scream from Father Murphy signaled the start of the encounter. A host of baboons under his command rolled down enormous stones on us that we were obliged to give up the contest, or some of us must inevitably have been killed. They actually followed us to our doors shouting their victory cry. So they didn't like fight the baboons. They didn't kill the baboons, according to his memoirs. They just like ran away.
They were routed by baboons.
Yes.
That's amazing. I love it.
So, yeah, and that is from the Memoirs of John Shipp, page 42 and 43.
Oh, dear.
All right. Paul, the last thing you want to say about the character, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, just the last thing is about, so Sean Bean played the character while the novel series was ongoing, but the earlier novels had been out for like about a dozen years or so. And the author, Cornwell, was so impressed with Bean's portrayal that he changed the character's backstory or expanded the backstory to have him be growing up in Yorkshire to match Bean's accent, and then also stopped mentioning that the character had black hair because Bean's blonde, and he basically was like, I'm gonna let the books kind of
I like
match
that.
As art imitates history or something.
And I particularly like that because you said he's not from South Essex. He's from Yorkshire.
Yeah.
John Shipp is from Essex.
Oh, okay,
so
yeah.
That's where that detail got in there. So, yeah, it's kind of cool that it moved from the historical inspiration to the actors.
Yeah, and I think both of those were worked in, basically, because Sharpe moved around because, no family.
So, great discussion. Paul, thank you so much for recommending this. To our listeners, what do you think? We'd love to hear your thoughts, feedback. We're getting a lot of the stuff we've gotten is for stuff that Paul hasn't watched yet, so I'm going to do spoilers for those things on other episodes, but keep the feedback coming. We love to see it. You can find all the ways to reach us by going to theethicalpanda.com. Most importantly there, you'll also find our Patreon content. You'll also find all this in the show notes. Patreon is what keeps this going. Listen to earlier articles, episodes, we talk a lot more about why this is so important right now, but important to note, we are donating 25% of all the Patreon income to the strike fund to help support the actors and the writers and everyone else who's being affected by these strikes, which is just really a lot of people. Part of our covering stuff like this is that I'm not covering any content made by the Hollywood studios. So we're covering, Japanese movies and British stuff and looking all over the world. A lot of great indie movies that I want us to cover. I just saw a great list of them that included some ones that I did not know were indie, including Memento, for example. So we might do some content on Memento. But yeah, there's lots of great stuff. Support our Patreon. It's a great way to help support us. You get ad-free content. But just look for The Ethical Panda. You'll find all my stuff. Look for Zen Madman. You'll find all of Paul's stuff. And I hope you sign up for Patreon. But if not, thank you so much for listening. We have spoken.